Greetings. I'm Bill Everhart with the Cleveland Architecture Foundation. We're pleased to be continuing our program of video interviews with Cleveland's most important architects in partnership with the Cleveland Public Library and their Oral History Initiative. Today we're pleased to welcome Paul Westlake, FAIA of the DLR Group. Paul will be interviewed by Tom Gallagher, also a principal with the DLR Group in their New York office. We're confident you'll find this interview to be very interesting and very inspiring. You'll be able to see the completed effort on the Cleveland Public Library's digital archive, as well as clevelandarchitecturefoundation.org. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that introduction. I have to say it's an honor to be sitting here with Paul as a friend and amazing mentor for me in my career, and be able to have this conversation about his career. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you. You've been a great partner and a great collaborator over almost 3 decades.
Yeah. What I'd like to start with is early tendencies to make you want to become an architect. What were the interests that early on made you interested in the profession?
You know, my parents' families were very involved in the arts and architecture and history. I was fortunate to have an uncle who was a very prominent architect. And he had designed a number of vessels for our own family. You know, my grandparents' house, which is a wonderful kind of Bauhaus composition, and other houses in the family, and a family compound on Martha's Vineyard. So I grew up in these great residential structures, and I often visited my uncle's studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was a partner with Hugh Stubbins.
One of the things I've always been fascinated by is your acute awareness of both the design aspect of architecture and the business aspect. And I know that that starts with your education. So it'd be great for you to speak to everyone about your education and the twofold nature of that.
Well, this architect uncle was a good mentor for me as a child, and he built a library for me. He used to give me very special books on the architecture of people like Wright and so on. But he encouraged me to go to the University of Pennsylvania to study under Lou Kahn. I had picked out the storm room, which actually overlooked the Richards Medical Building designed by Kahn, which was kind of a touchstone for me on campus. I had to pay for part of my own education, so I was in a work-study program at Penn. And ironically, I was assigned to work in the office of the dean of the Wharton School, Sam Sapienza. And one day, Dr. Sapienza said, "Are you taking any classes at Wharton?" Penn divided into the College of Arts and Sciences and the Wharton School. And I said no, and he said, "Would you like to?" And I said yes, and he said okay. And I registered for this economics class and liked it and did very well. The next semester he said, "Would you care to go to the Wharton School?" And I said, "Well, I'm already in the college studying to be an architect." And he said, "I could arrange for you to do both." And so he arranged that I could get a dual degree in 4 years without paying any additional tuition, but I had to take 8 or 9 courses a semester. And so I graduated actually in finance from the Wharton School. I also graduated from the college with a major in architecture. In summer jobs, I sometimes worked in finance for major companies like General Electric because they paid a lot more than architecture. The exposure to finance really came from the dean of the Wharton School.
And then from there you went on to Harvard.
Lou Kahn died when I was almost finishing Penn. Otherwise I would have gone to graduate school at Penn and tried to continue being in the orbit of Lou Kahn. So my next marker was to study in the orbit of Le Corbusier at Harvard. So I switched and I went to the Harvard School of Design for 3.5 years, and then I cross-registered at the Harvard Business School and took courses in finance and real estate development. And so I always had this kind of dual application in business, if you will, and in design. Given the choice, I would have rather worked in architecture than in finance or in business.
Louis Kahn was one of the icons, obviously, of the 20th century, and certainly gaining more prestige and favor nowadays in terms of his timeless quality. I know that you also intersected with Jose Luis Sert in Cambridge. You were involved in the architectural review.
Yeah, I was a co-founder of the Harvard Architecture Review, which was dealing with architectural theory. When I was at Harvard, it was really at the advent of postmodernism, although Harvard was really a modernist camp in the tradition of Le Corbusier and Sert. It was a scholarly venture. It brought us into the field of a lot of architects that we interviewed, that we solicited, that we brought in as advisors to our board, and it just opened up a whole other world across the country of luminaries that we met through that venture. But it was a publishing venture.
So a lot of people, no doubt, are interested in how you came to Cleveland and the whole transition from such an elevated educational experience. And coming to Cleveland versus staying on the East Coast, no doubt there were opportunities, multiple cities on the East Coast. Can you explain a little bit about how you moved back and your roots here in the Cleveland area?
Well, I'm originally from Ohio. I'm like an 8th generation Ohioan. And I met my wife Suzanne in Ohio. And so we both had family here and we had roots here. And we had a 1-year-old when we moved to Ohio, and I think it was kind of a quality of life thing. It's like, where can you afford to live and work and be also with the support of family? I would say as soon as we came into Ohio, I was plotting how to get back to the East Coast. It was an attitude that this is a mistake. You know, I've been away from here for 8 or 9 years, working in Cambridge and Philadelphia and going to school. And I'm back here for family reasons, but I shouldn't be here. But my wife's father, who was a wonderful guy, very savvy guy, had this strategy that he would commission me to design a house for he and his wife without any stylistic or financial limitation. And it was a gambit to keep his daughter, my wife, and his granddaughter in Ohio. So that became like my first big moonlighting project to do this house, which is known as the Grimm House, which is my wife's maiden name.
Fantastic. So you came back to this area and started working independently?
Actually, there was somebody I worked with. I had used my parents as a guinea pig one summer when I was at Harvard to renovate and expand their house. And they had moved into Hudson, Ohio. And I said, well, I need to work also in another job that summer while I'm overseeing this construction. So I went to work for an architect, William Morris, who did a lot of residential work. After school, went to Philadelphia and worked for Lou Sauer. And Bill Morris called me and made me an offer to be a partner at age 27 in his firm in Ohio. And so when we decided to come back to Ohio, I went to work for Bill Morris for about a year for various reasons, but mostly related to the interest rates, the dissolution of his practice, which was largely driven by developers and dependent on interest rates. His practice was struggling. And I was reading and reading and reading about this guy, Peter Van Dyke, in the Cleveland area, and I thought, I've got to finish this house for my wife's parents, but I'm going to shift over and work under this other guy as a mentor and work in a more kind of corporate firm, if you will. And I'm going to do that until the house is done. And as soon as the house is done, I'm going to move back to the East Coast. That was my plan.
And how would you describe the Van Dyke firm, which I think was
Dalton Van Dyke Johnson.
Yeah.
Life is a lot about timing. It's a really interesting thing. But when I interviewed there, the interview got interrupted by kind of this cacophony and celebration. And what had happened was that the Cleveland Clinic had made a phone call to the office and awarded the office what we called the Century Project, which was 450-bed hospital wing, the outpatient building, the connector to the hotel. It would be $1.5 billion. And it was about 10 in the morning. They shut down the pruning machine. They rolled out the bar on the printing machine where all the prints came out,
Right, yeah.
and everybody partied until like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. They said, "You're hired." I met Peter Van Dyke, who had incredible infectious enthusiasm. And Pete said, "I have a project for you to design a library at Ursuline College." First project.
Wow.
And I thought, fantastic. I get to work with this guy, and I get to do a really important building in the courtyard of this campus that our firm had designed. So that was my first assignment at Dalton Van Dyke Johnson. It was a dream assignment.
That's incredible. So that, at the time, the firm was doing, as I understand, medical or healthcare, as well as higher ed and historic preservation, adaptive reuse. It was pretty broad or mixed, or was there areas of specialization?
I wouldn't say that higher ed was a big part of the practice, but healthcare, I would say, was the body of the practice. There was, I think our office, and it's probably true today, has invoiced the Cleveland Clinic every month since 1935. So the clinic was an important client. And there were other medical institutions that we were working for. Cleveland was a city and is a city where there has been, since the 1920s, very little new construction compared to a lot of cities. You know, it's no Dallas or Phoenix or Austin or Los Angeles. It was a city that was rich with landmarks. And a lot of the work was in the preservation and adaptive reuse of those landmarks. And you know, if you didn't work in that field, you often didn't work in Cleveland. But there were incredible opportunities to work on these landmarks, and Peter Van Dyke really embraced it. He was a modernist, trained under Saarinen, as was my uncle, but Pete really saw value in things like the Burnham Root, Society for Savings Bank, or the Graham Anderson Probst and White Huntington Building, or Playhouse Square. And when I first came into the office, the entire model room floor was covered with cardboard of the Playhouse Square district model. And we were doing it pro bono.
Wow.
And we were working on the Ohio Theater, which was the first project that we had renovated and brought to life at Playhouse Square. And I think that opened in 1981, and that's when I came into the firm.
And there's an important intersection of that with the work at Blossom that the firm had done previously, for Cleveland Orchestra, and the cultural aspect.
Well, we had been very, very fortunate to be commissioned to do Blossom Music Center, the summer home of the Cleveland Orchestra. And that was really a seminal project for the firm because it was a modern icon. And I think there was awareness then of the work of the firm throughout the entire community. It was this gift of a really treasured asset in the region. You had the Cleveland Orchestra that was a client, and you had Playhouse Square that was a client here in Cleveland, Ohio. And it took some time for that to create an awareness that we could grow a larger practice out of that. But those are, say, the roots of the firm in that era.
One of the next most significant projects was the Temple Hoyne Buell Theater in Denver, where you got to travel and expand the practice nationally a little bit, get a taste of that, but then also take that cultural practice into another area with another set of clients. And I understand that was also a significant early theater project for you, and I'd specifically like to understand, as someone that's expert in cultural and theater work, what that was like to do your first major theater project like that.
Well, I would say that this is probably the most transformational experience I had early in my career. What happened was a commission in Denver, which was an international competition with architects like Isozaki. We won this commission to do this new Broadway Roadhouse. It was the principal theater of the state of Colorado, 2,830 seats. It was part of a larger complex that included retail and the renovation of a 1908 auditorium. I mean, it was a very significant commission nationally. One of the stipulations, and Denver at the time was in a recession, was that we expend about half the architectural dollars in Denver. And so that required us setting up an office in Denver and hiring architects in Denver to work under our direction. So for about 2 years, every Monday, I would fly out of Cleveland and fly into Denver. And with the time change, you could walk into the office before 9 o'clock in the morning. We had a staff in Denver to design, and I designed through Wednesday night, and I flew back to Cleveland Thursday morning, and we had a second design team in Cleveland that I directed. And so we worked between these two studios on the design and executed that project, which was published in Architecture magazine and award-winning. First of all, it was an education in performing arts, but it gave me this incredible love of cultural arts design. But I think there was another thing that was really significant in that I really loved the experience of working in a different region of the country, to be exposed to different climate and resources and topography. I mean, we lined the entire theater with Colorado sandstone, and it's working in a regional material palette. Those are the virtues of, say, working outside of your home base. You know, it's interpreting local resources and culture. And so when the project ended and I left Denver, I had a tremendous sense of loss and regret that we hadn't used the time to develop a client base and continued to work in Denver. Like, why did we squander the opportunity? Why didn't we continue to work in Denver? We had this significant high-profile commission. And so I vowed that would never happen again.
That's a good transition to an early project in Phoenix and all your great work in building up the first studio for the firm in the Phoenix area. So tell us about the Orpheum Theater and what that you then did with that in Phoenix.
Well, this is a bit of a Playhouse Square story because I think a lot of people in Cleveland know of the role of the Junior League of raising $50,000 to stop the demolition of historic theaters in Cleveland. That was noticed by other chapters of the Junior League across the country. And Phoenix Junior League had this initiative to restore the Orpheum Theater, which was the only kind of historic theater in Phoenix that had been dark since 1986 and was begging for restoration. And so the Junior League of Phoenix said, well, why don't we go find the architects who did this in Cleveland and bring them into Phoenix. And so we did this project. It took 9 years. It was 4 phases, each publicly bid. We worked also with a private foundation who was raising money for the theater as well as the city. And it was a really kind of prominent client group. And we could see that this project was going to be really successful, a real prize. And remembering the debacle of Denver, where we had not leveraged that project to build a practice, we said, this isn't going to happen in Phoenix. And so I started to network with the people that we had met in Phoenix, and also other targets like the director of the museum and different arts leaders. And the managing partner of the firm at the time said, you're spending a lot of time in Phoenix. So I said, yeah, I'm thinking of starting an office there. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, if you can find $100,000 in revenue in the first year, we'll start an office in Phoenix. In the first year, we found almost $7 million in revenue. The previous year, the firm's revenue was $3.5 million. You know, we captured a major healthcare system. We worked for Arizona State University. We found a museum in Yuma, Arizona, and we built a practice. And the firm was 92 years old, and it was the first office ever outside of the Cleveland office. And we doubled the size of the firm, and we more than doubled the revenues in the first year. And that was somewhat seminal and transformational in terms of our practice.
I joined the firm in 1994, and I remember you saying soon after that, probably 95, 96, at this time, that you envisioned that no longer was the market for the firm just the 3 million in the Ohio area, but the 300 million of the country. And
Yeah.
you know, the other thing that I remember happening at that time was the beginning of the integration of different disciplines. Obviously, theaters have a lot of consultants. They're highly technical in nature. There's acousticians, theater technical, audiovisual, lighting. Could you say a little bit about how you worked with theater consultants on the Denver project, and then how you worked on it in Phoenix, and then what happened within the firm about that time?
We were having an initiative to try to figure out how to perform these performing arts projects with greater efficiency. And one of the ideas that came out of this work session we had in the office was to start to form alliances with key consultants like acousticians or theatrical consultants, and just zero in on one consultant and really form a bond with that one consultant. And so we collectively agreed that a certain firm should be the acoustician audiovisual consultant. And then I asked about the theatrical consultant, and everybody said, well, we should only use Daryl Ziegler. And Daryl wasn't a firm. He was actually a theater consultant within a New York firm, Roger Morgan Studio, who had worked on all the work at Playhouse Square. That was the start of diversification. And then in Phoenix, in about 1997, when we had started the architectural group, we also were having trouble with getting the attention of local engineers. The market was very busy. We were the new kids on the block. No firms kind of paid attention to us. And so I had the idea that perhaps we should integrate that and have our own engineers. And so we added a mechanical engineer to the firm, and then we added electrical and plumbing, and then we started adding structural. So in '97, we not only opened our first office other than Cleveland, but we added the first disciplines other than architecture in theatrical, mechanical, and electrical. And eventually we grew that to become the most deeply diversified firm in the world, with now 25 disciplines.
The firm, before the opening of the Phoenix office, had hovered between 30 and 40 people for decades.
Yes.
And at
Yes.
this time is when the expansion of that staff growth,
Yeah.
both in Cleveland and Phoenix. I remember you saying that as much as we love the renovation and historic preservation of cultural projects, theaters in particular, the desire to also do more new construction of theaters, and that was a goal at that time, and that it was a marker that we set and ultimately achieved.
But also, we would get involved in all of these proposals and interviews, and we were kind of coming in from Cleveland, and everybody wanted the New York architect and New York theater consultant. There was a bit of a move in strategy in order to build the national practice of also being seen as more ubiquitous nationally. And so, you know, I took our letterhead and I stuffed Cleveland underneath Phoenix. Now, Phoenix wasn't New York City, but it was a step ahead of that. You know, you provided the opportunity in 2004 to have a New York office, which suddenly gave us the dress internationally that was important. It's kind of the cultural capital in New York, and also gave us access to a whole different caliber of specialty staff and disciplines. The fact is that in the 1990s, I was kind of in the I formation behind the head of design, Peter Van Dyke, and the managing partner, Dick Pace. I was not leading either of those. I was kind of in second position. And I think Phoenix for me represented something that I owned, if you will. I mean, for which I was responsible in terms of client leadership, development, design, and directing staff. I really love that opportunity. So every Monday morning for about 5 years, I would fly to Phoenix, and then I would red-eye back, usually on Thursday night. We were working in California and all throughout the western part of the United States. We opened up a whole new market for us. But I found it very exciting, to design in different climate, different cultures, different architectural contexts. And the great thing about it also was the West didn't have the kind of phobias about modernism that the more conservative northern and eastern part of the country had. It was very hard to do modern work, as Peter Van Dyke found out in Cleveland. I mean, when I did the Hathaway Brown School primary school edition, which I thought was great. It was flat roofed, kind of a curved facade. It was not in the language of the Jacobean context designed by Walker and Weeks. I was almost run out of town. It was the opposite. You go into Phoenix, Yuma, Arizona, Palm Springs, California, Nevada, it's a very different taste culture, design culture. And so I was also trying to crack open the portfolio of the firm, break down any kind of connotation of geography. We were not entirely Cleveland-centric firm anymore. We had a diversified national practice. We had multiple offices. We had various disciplines. And we also then started to distill the specialization of the firm into just several different building types. And they were healthcare, which was a traditional specialty, performing arts or cultural arts based on the work at the Cleveland Museum and the Roots in Cleveland, Cleveland Orchestra, Cleveland Institute of Music. And also we had a national practice in restoration and adaptive reuse, which grew out of the historic theaters and work on landmarks in Cleveland like the Federal Reserve Bank. So we started going after those segments of the portfolio, but to do it on a national level out of multiple offices versus a local level out of Cleveland.
Yeah, the Yuma Museum and Arizona State, Old Main, good projects or examples of projects during that period. Tell us a little bit about the Tempe Arts Center competition and kind of what that meant to you at the time.
I look back on that, and I did at the time, and thought it was the greatest loss of anything for which we competed. You don't have the same emotion with all projects, winning or losing. That one to me was going to completely establish us in Arizona in national arts. And it was a competition of 32 firms, and we placed second. I was really devastated by it. But on the other hand, I was pleased by the design process and by the portfolio that we produced in relation to that competition. And it was, because it was an alluvial plain, it was the Salt River, which is only occasionally wet, in spring storms. It's a very kind of irregular, organic landscape. And so we interpreted that in the form of the architecture. And it has these alluvial forms which, reference the Salt River. It was so much of a loss. I really wanted to see that built, and it kind of broke open new horizons. By abandoning kind of Cartesian geometry and really responding to the kind of organic nature of the site. And so sometimes you can win by losing, or the losses can really influence you. And that's where I do think that, the portfolio unbuilt can be as important as the built portfolio because it shows intentions and allows you to kind of explore.
I'm sure that you would say that that's heavily influenced subsequent projects.
It was really a
current
turning
ones.
point. It was a dramatic turning point in the portfolio and just the approach to form. That to break entirely out of say, orthogonal Cartesian geometries and embrace a more organic form and the sculptural nature of that.
So two projects that were significant landmarks here in Cleveland that are also more on the historic preservation side are the Metzenbaum Courthouse and Federal Reserve Bank. It'd be good to hear a little bit about your involvement in those projects.
These are such beautiful buildings. You can learn so much from them. They teach you so much about detailing and materials and color and texture. I mean, they're an architectural education in themselves. So the opportunity to work on the almost 500,000 square foot Federal Reserve Bank was one of the greatest design opportunities I had at that point in my career. And also to work on the Metzenbaum Federal Building. The Metzenbaum actually became the model for Cleveland's group plan. And it was the first building built within that assemblage. And it was, you know, an incredible example of neoclassical architecture. And it was a comprehensive restoration and adaptive reuse, but it also involved new work in that we kind of skated outside of the brief of the program, and we proposed spending about another $30 million and enclosing the courtyard and making that an atrium, which actually would change the entire circulation so that the public circulation would go through the middle of the building and leave the perimeter also for the occupants. And that project received the national award from the GSA and 20 other design awards, and was one of our first sustainable design models. It led then to about 20 years of continuous work with the GSA, culminating in the US State Department, which we are still working on in Washington, and a number of other landmarks, working for the architect of the Capitol, the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress. The Reserve Bank, when it was completed, was considered the last word in bank design in the world. So I really enjoyed working on that. It involved the restoration of the incredible lobby and the 8th floor, which was, you know, very few people get to see, but it was kind of the banker's floor. And then it adapted and performed new work in the cafeteria and many other floors of the building. And M.K. Ferguson was the 1930 U.S. Post Office, also designed by Walker and Weeks, which had been abandoned in the 1980s. Forest City bought the complex. I was brought in as kind of the project architect, project designer to renovate that 500,000 square foot building and turn it into the corporate headquarters of M.K. Ferguson. I think it's that, you know, you have to be creative, you have to be reverent, but you can't be too reverent. You can't give birth to the corpse. You have to inject historic work with a new vitality. And that's what causes landmarks to be extended: economic purpose and vitality. And so I think that that portfolio of those three projects, the atrium of the Metzenbaum, the lobby and the adaptive reuse of M.K. Ferguson, and then the new work within the Federal Reserve Bank, like the 10th floor gymnasium and the cafeteria and so on, those are the things that imbue the new energy and vitality in these buildings. And so you have both the best of the old and you have the best of new work.
And they're holding up so well. I know that many other landmarks, going back to the cultural work related to the strategy of these projects here in Cleveland, many of the other landmark theaters that you've worked on, the Balboa Theater in San Diego, the Coronado in Rockford, Tennessee Theater in Knoxville, and then also the Strand Capitol Theaters in York, Pennsylvania, had many similar aspects where you're blending the new and the old. Tell us about the significance of that geographical footprint and the impact on the firm at that time.
I wish that we could get more projects doing landmark theaters, but we got 100 projects doing landmark theaters, and it was like, show me the new stuff. But we got this reputation for being able to breathe new life into these theaters. And a lot of these were done in the era that, Tom, you were in the firm and were involved in design and development of these. They were done in the 1990s, largely, early 2000s. This was a movement across the country of revitalizing downtowns, giving them new life by restoring these assets, and that they would be the magnets for population to return to downtown. What they had in common was that they were all landmarks. And so they all had an aspect of preservation. They all had to adapt to serve the purpose of arts today. I mean, they were originally movie palaces or opera houses. And not just the systems and technology were outdated, but they didn't also suit the needs of contemporary audiences. So you needed to preserve the best of the old and then figure out how to adapt them to new program. What we brought to the table, which actually involved us in a lot of these commissions, was the idea that we could bring equity financing to the projects. And we also became experts in the application of preservation tax incentives on a state and federal level, and also new markets credits. And in some of these projects, we were able to find up to 55% of the project costs, not construction costs, project costs, through those mechanisms. And we did that without any extra charge. We just said, okay, that comes along with the theatrical design and the architecture and engineering. We're going to help bring $12 million in equity to the project. And it actually then required us to meet the federal preservation standards, and it required the owners to develop operating pro formas and business plans that allowed them to get the tax credits and the new market credits. And so it was a financial exercise that was overlaid on an architectural design and preservation exercise. And I think that's what so positioned us in the development of landmarks. And we brought that here. We brought to Playhouse Square, at the Hanna Theater and so on. We brought it to the Union Club of Cleveland. I mean, almost every historic project we touched, the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, we said, why don't you use tax credits? I mean, we'll bring 15 million of funding money to the project. So we applied a financial model also to a design model on those projects. But we did them in a integrated design model, and we were the only firm doing that. So most firms would come in, we're architects and we do these major performing arts projects. And we said, we will do the structural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, AV, IT, lighting, security, architecture, sustainable design, tax credits. I mean, we brought all those disciplines to the project as kind of one-stop shopping. And we built the most diversified enterprise in the world of consulting disciplines, mostly based here in Cleveland, Ohio.
Well, this is all about the time of a major transition in the firm, close to 9/11. And, you were one of several partners at that time, but then made transitions in the firm. And it'd be good to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is definitely a turning point. So Peter Van Dyke was in the middle of his ownership transition, which involved some financial transition for the firm. And then it was Ron Reed and Vince Laskowski and Dick Pace and myself. Sure enough, in December of that, just 2 months after the 9/11 event, we had two major commissions that were terminated by clients. They were the two largest commissions of the firm. They comprised 2/3 of our backlog. And one was a new museum on Lake Erie, and the other was a major project for the Cleveland Clinic at Hillcrest Hospital. We were in the middle of the transition of Peter Van Dyke, and now Dick Pace was resigning. And I think we had a choice of either dissolving the firm, liquidating the firm, or carrying on. That really changed my responsibilities because suddenly I was both the lead designer and I was the managing partner. We also were fortunate that within a short period of time, some wonderful commissions did come to us. The Cleveland Clinic came back and said, yes, the Hillcrest Hospital project will go ahead, which we designed and we're very proud of. But I think a really significant thing that happened, and it happened in 2002, so this is really shortly thereafter, somebody approached us and asked us if we would be interested in talking to a client about building a cultural complex on the site of the 1969 Woodstock Music and Arts Festival, which was very exciting to me. I used to have a rock band. I played guitar. I just loved the whole idea of working on that iconic site. And anyway, we met that client, and we brought that client into the Cleveland area, and he saw Blossom Music Center and fell in love with it. And he said, yeah, I want to hire that team. He had hired and terminated Richard Meyer. He had hired and terminated HOK. And so we were like the third go around. We took on that commission, and it was a major, major effort. He bought 8,000 acres, and he ultimately developed 250 acres. And that owner was rather unique. I mean, he built a business worth several $1 billion from nothing. I mean, he knew a lot about building and landscape and materials, and he really had a kind of an engineering mind. And you worked with him kind of one-on-one. And so even though we were building this practice and I was the managing partner, in 2004, I worked 2,200 hours on that one project. We flew there every week, and that was our first really, really major new build cultural project. It involved a museum, the Museum of Woodstock, which you worked on. So it was an interpretive museum as well, which became part of our portfolio. We later worked on the exhibits for the Rock Hall. We did the Pro Football Hall of Fame. We did the Mob Museum in Las Vegas and all these other interpretive museums that followed from this. It was an incredible design experience to work with that client and work on that site.
And you mentioned the Mob Museum and the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Those two had strong context that you need to understand and react to. The Mob Museum in particular was, had some courtrooms apparently that a lot of the mob, passed through, and then particularly the Football Hall of Fame is such an iconic structure that's known by all. Tell us a little bit about how you kind of absorbed those contexts and reacted to them with the designs there.
Yeah, the Mob Museum was a lot of fun. The mayor of Las Vegas came out of Philadelphia. He was an attorney who actually defended mob figures like Bugsy Siegel. I mean, he tried to get mobsters off of death row. He had this great fascination with the mob and the history in Vegas of organized crime and so on. But the building was the original federal building, and it was built in 1930. And it was built because there was an enormous amount of federal money flooding through Las Vegas to build the Hoover Dam. And they needed some control, parental control. So the federal government came in. They eventually abandoned that landmark and went to a new federal building. And they sold the building to the mayor for $1. And the mayor had this idea of doing this themed museum, and he found us because we did interpretive museums. The reason the building was so important to the whole story was that the 1950s Kefauver hearings, Senator Kefauver, to organized crime, had occurred in that courtroom. So we made that, in effect, an exhibit. And there's a hologram of the Kefauver trial, and we had to interpret almost every part of the federal building, for the museum, and we used tax credits.
And what about the Pro Football Hall of Fame in terms of what that addition did for that building and how you reacted to the...
I think one of the ways we got that job, which was kind of interesting, I mean, we did have kind of the portfolio in interpretive museums and cultural projects, but we came to the interview also saying that we were going to bring economic value. You can see this is a consistent theme of mine. And I actually partnered with International Management Group, who was going to actually study how to improve their operating model. How would they get more sponsorships? How would they get events? How would they change the pro forma? So architecture is one thing, but we wanted to redo the whole business model first and figure out what that should be, and then the architecture would follow that. But what was exciting about that architecturally was you had this kind of silly icon, which was the symbol of the football on top of this rotunda, which is the kind of the apex of the building. And we had to preserve that, and then we wanted to figure out how to honor that but inflect towards that. And so if you see that design, there's this, the original material of that building is kind of bland. It's all a brownish brick, and kind of a somber palette. I mean, there's no vitality there. So we did this much more contemporary entrance, and we did this wing that surmounted the building, which actually inflected towards and pointed towards the football. That's the relationship between the two. It's like, here's the icon of the football, and then here's this canopy that just sweeps over to it. There's historic context, but there's new work, and then you have to figure out how to relate the two. But you also have to bring vitality to the complex.
I see a number of similarities with the current Museum of Natural History project and some others where a facade, a small addition, has a transformative effect on the image of a building. And we'll get there, but before we go there, tell me a little bit in terms of the interpretive museum experience. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame obviously is an iconic building here by a world-renowned architect, and you've been working there for quite a few years.
We are not the lead designers of the expansion of the Rock Hall. We're part of the architect of record team, and practice of architecture and urbanism, POW, is the lead designer. But we've done everything architecturally, interiors, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and in specialties and exhibit design that's been done there since the original project. And we're still involved in the expansion.
So going back to the kind of image reimagining of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and also I would say, well, to talk about two projects there, your planetarium project, which was a stark contrast to the existing context, which I find interesting, but then now the current reimagining of that context and re-imaging of it.
Yeah, well, this is without a doubt one of my favorite commissions. It's now spanning over several decades, but I did the planetarium with Joe Shafran family in 2000. I think it opened in 2001. And now we're doing the expansion, which is part of a $150 million project, which is, the shell's pretty well complete. They gave us a site which is a foreground site in front of a fairly humble backdrop of red brick that Peter Van Dyke had designed. But a planetarium is a very, very tough form to compose because basically it's circular in form. the ceiling is a hemisphere because it's a projection surface. A cylinder is kind of a tough form to put in front of that museum. But I was always challenged by astronomy. I could never kind of remember how to find all the constellations, but I knew that if you found the North Star, you could find the constellations. Like if you read Michener's The Islanders, you know, he talks about the islanders crossing the equator and they find a new star, the North Star, and they're terrified of it because it doesn't move. All the other stars seem to move. If you're in Cleveland, Ohio at 42.3 degrees north latitude, the North Star is at 42.3 degrees. And then, you know, all the other constellations seem to rotate around that. So I thought, you know, I was told that all Cleveland school children go to the planetarium and their target audience is a fourth grader. And what I wanted to do was design it to be an educational instrument. And so we took this cylinder, which of course has universal geometry. We put a roof on top of it and we chamfered it. And we chamfered it at the latitude, about 43 degrees. And when you create a chamfer of a circle, it creates an ellipse. An ellipse has a short axis and has a longitudinal axis. And so that would be oriented to polar north. That's what governed the geometry of the building.
Right.
And then what we did was we created an exedra, and at the center of the exedra, at the eye height of an average fourth grader, if you stood there and you sighted along the longitudinal axis, you would always find the North Star at the tip. And then you could find the constellations. So that's what governed the design. So it simulates the antique astronomical instruments that are in the collection, that are bronze instruments. And then there are frozen stars that are embedded within the skin. Everything, you know, had a purpose, everything had a story, and everything was about meaning and education. In 2007, they had a interview to see who would expand the museum. And there was no malice from the original project, but the museum wanted the architect that had done the Museum of the U.S. Marine in Quantico, Virginia, which was very iconic, which is done by Fentress. And we had done this really iconic design. It was more biomorphic. It was not so architectural. They didn't select that design, they selected Fentress, and they worked on it for about 10 years and they didn't raise the money, and for a variety of circumstances, they came to us and they asked us if we would work on the renovation part of the project because Fentress didn't want to be involved in the renovation, only in the new construction. And I said, no, we're not interested in that. I said, we'll only work on this if we can be involved in the new construction. And I said, why don't you do this? Make it into a competition, design competition, provide a budget, provide a program, and then you'll decide how you want to proceed. But if we win it, we'll do both the renovation and the addition. And if we lose it, so be it. But we won't do the renovation. And we won it. And this came out of our work in China. And I think it's kind of my belief that a concept for a project is the beginning, and it's the middle, and it's the end, meaning it's everything. You need this kind of big idea. And that's how you win work in these big competitions in China. We started thinking about our work for the competition, and we said, okay, nobody sketches anything. Let's do some research. Let's think about a theme, something thematic. What's the big idea? And we came to the idea that our region, which is its natural history, is basically a product of the glaciers invading northeastern Ohio and carrying glacier moraine. It created the river systems, the creeks, the topography, the soil structure, and the Great Lakes, which provide a third of the fresh water in the world. And we said, why don't we make this locally influenced about the glacier? And that is where we came up with the image of the skin in the organic form, to not have any commercial connotation. There's no building built for commercial purpose that would be, referenced by this. It would be just an invention for this place. But the other thing, and you know this because you worked on so many projects involving this with me, there's this belief that you should expose the activity within the building. And almost everything you and I work on, including your recent project in Joplin, Missouri, the idea is to expose that. Right. How do you have variable enclosure, or how do you design the building and compose it in a way that you can open it up so that there's like visual commerce between the external environment and inside. So that is a glazed facade, the new exhibit wing. And fortunately, we've been able to interpret that as bringing the century exhibits to the glass and exposing them to Wade Oval. It's probably the only natural history museum in the world that will expose its collection.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.